Yes, President Lyndon B. Johnson was privately informed of the possibility that Cuba was behind JFK's assassination, and he was deeply disturbed by that theory. Multiple sources confirm that Johnson believed a Cuban connection was plausible, but he intentionally buried it to avoid triggering World War III. Here's a breakdown of the evidence. Johnson was briefed on the Cuba connection. After the assassination, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson was privately informed that Cuba was behind JFK's assassination, and he was deeply disturbed by that theory. Multiple sources confirmed that Johnson believed a Cuban connection was plausible, but he intentionally buried it to avoid triggering a war with Cuba. Here's a breakdown of the evidence. Johnson was briefed on the Cuba connection. After the assassination, U.S. intelligence officials, including from the CIA and FBI, provided Johnson with early intelligence pointing to Lee Harvey Oswald's ties to Cuba and to the Cuban DGI, Cuba's KGB. This included Oswald's pro-Castro activism, his attempt to get a visa through the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, his association with left-wing groups sympathetic to the Cuban regime, Johnson's private admission to Senator Richard Russell. One of the most revealing moments came during a phone call with Senator Richard Russell, who served on the Warren Commission. Johnson to Russell, 1964, declassified. We don't want to start a war over this. Hell, I don't want to stir up anything that's going to lead to war. Johnson implied that if the truth about Cuba came out, it would force the U.S. to retaliate militarily, which would have risked a free Cuba without Castro. CIA's Mexico City memo, Cuba and Oswald. The CIA had surveillance of Oswald at the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. CIA Director John McCone and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover briefed Johnson about it. McCone reported that Castro had been aware of Oswald's intentions. Johnson stated, "We were running a scam murder incorporated in the Caribbean," a reference to Operation Mongoose, the CIA's joke assassination plots against Castro. The implication: Cuba had a motive to strike back, and Johnson feared that confirming Cuban involvement would obligate U.S. military retaliation. According to E. Howard Hunt, later involved in Watergate, Johnson privately expressed belief that Cuba may have been involved, but that it was better for the country not to know. Johnson may not have believed Cuba was definitively responsible, but he believed that the evidence was strong enough to implicate Cuba. Revealing that connection would force a U.S. invasion of Cuba, or worse, forced overthrow and risking civilian Cuban control. Investigations by elected Cuban officials demonstrating U.S. prior involvement in Castro's rise to power. Johnson's guiding thought: we got to convince the public Oswald acted alone, or we go to war. The dictator who was never meant to fall. Fidel Castro was not the hunted man of Cold War legend. He was a Cold War tool, installed, tolerated, and protected by the very forces that claimed to oppose him. The CIA helped bring him to power. The State Department legitimized his rule. The media whitewashed his ideology. The assassination of John F. Kennedy, which may have been direct retaliation for U.S. media plots to kill Castro, was intentionally covered up to avoid confrontation with a regime America had created. The Castro deception is not just about Cuba. It's about how democracies die in shadows and how truths are buried for the greater good. The world mourned Kennedy, but history never got its answer because the most dangerous truth was this: Castro didn't outwit the CIA. He was their creation, their thug in Havana. Even in 2025, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe.